Besamusca, and I am the project leader of the BARWAGE project. And let me just get my presentation started. Yeah. So welcome to the seminar or the webinar on collective bargaining in times of rising minimum wages, which is also the BARWAGE final conference. And over the past 2 years, I have led the BARWAGE project with my amazing colleagues from Utrecht University, the Central European Labour Studies Institute in Bratislava, the Italian Fondazione Giuseppe Di Vittorio, and of course with the WageIndicator Foundation. And today, we want to share with you some of the main takeaways from our research that we believe are crucial to the debate about wages in Europe. And I have the pleasure of kicking that off with an introduction to the project. And I'll focus in that on the results that we think are most relevant to the EU Minimum Wage Directive and to the context of rising minimum wages, because we really didn't want to spend this time just going through every report and every tiny detail of what we found. We really wanted to try and see if we can focus on some of the most relevant aspects for the policy debate, and that is a debate that we'd also really much love to have with you. So, to start at the beginning, in recent years, as many of you know, concerns over over growing inequality and a standard of living have sparked policy tension for decent wages or adequate wages in Europe. And the 2022 EU Minimum Wage Directive puts stock basically in 2 policy instruments to reach that goal. The first, statutory minimum wages or equivalents thereof, and secondly, collective bargaining. And the EU Minimum Wage Directive also sets a target for minimum wages to be fixed at least at 50% of the average wage or 60% of the median wage. And as the figure on the slide here shows, which is made by our colleagues from the European Trade Union Institute, most member states do not actually currently reach that target. So only Portugal, France, Slovenia, and Bulgaria do. And you'll see that in those countries with the big red arrows also at the top, you'll see that the horizontal red bars actually reach or cross the red line that indicates the EU threshold. I'm going to be showing in my presentation some figures. Now, if figures make you a little nervous, don't worry, you can follow everything without looking at the figures and just listening to the text or looking at the text on the slide. If you really prefer the figures and you don't like all the talk around this, then just consider my voice the background voice and look at the real art on the right side of the slides. But so minimum wage target really shows that we have some work to do to actually reach that in view of the current levels of minimum wages in Europe. And so what about the second policy instrument, collective bargaining? In the BARWAGE project, we analyzed the wage floors, so the lowest wages agreed in over 1,200 collective bargaining agreements negotiated in 10 countries over the past 15 years or so. And together with my amazing colleague at Utrecht University, Andrea Medina Ojeda, we compared those bargained wage floors that we found in the collective agreements to Eurostat's risk of poverty thresholds. And those thresholds are set at 60% of the median and indicate that you are expected, if you earn above that level, you're not expected to be vulnerable to falling into poverty. Being set at 60% of the median also means that they're effectively set at the same level as the target of the EU Minimum Wage Directive. But in this case, they're broken down for one-person households and for family households, including 2 adults and 2 children. And when we look at those 1,200 collective agreements covering 10 countries in 15 years, we find that in all 10 countries, on average, the wage floors in those collective bargaining agreements fix the wages that are sufficient to lift a one-person household above the at-risk of poverty threshold. And you can see that by the blue bars exceeding the horizontal red line that's set at the ratio of 1. However, you can also see that the red bars only exceed that at-risk of poverty threshold in Bulgaria in this case. And that indicates that the negotiated wages in those collective agreements are not sufficient for a single earner to sustain a family of 2 adults and 2 children, at a level that does not put them at risk of poverty. And that's particularly worrisome in the case of Estonia, where you see that that red bar reaches only until about 0.5 or even below that, which means that even two workers earning the negotiated wage floor do not yet exceed that at risk of poverty threshold. So that indicates to us that collective bargaining is not some kind of like magic bullet that just automatically and necessarily guarantees adequate wages for everyone, everywhere. But there's better news too. And because one crucial aspect of collective bargaining is that it often includes more than just a wage floor. And many collective bargaining agreements include detailed pay systems with minimum pay rates payable for a range of jobs. So they would include things like what a janitor is supposed to earn, what a cashier is supposed to earn, what a salesperson is supposed to earn, what a lawyer is supposed to earn, etc. And we see in our research that even if the bargained wage floors are actually very close to the minimum wage level in many collective agreements, collective bargaining does increase the probability that a worker earns more than the minimum wage. And that means that there is some upward push of wages there through those collective agreements. And so we see that workers who are employed in firms covered by collective bargaining agreements are 33% more likely to earn over 110% of the statutory minimum wage, meaning that they have wages that are much more likely to be a little bit above that minimum wage than workers in firms that are not covered by collective agreements. And my colleague Martin Guzzi, who conducted this research together with Kea Tynens and myself, will tell you a little bit more about this in about half an hour from now. So when we take this information and we look at the level of collective bargaining and the level of wages and minimum wages, in the BARWAGE project, we then ask, what is the minimum wage directive? What can that mean for workers higher up in the earnings distribution? If the minimum wage goes up, can they expect a wage increase too? Or is this just for the lowest wage workers? And we ask how rising minimum wages are put pressure on collective bargaining. And so we go back to that insight there that partners involved in collective bargaining consider not just the minimum wage floor and the lowest part to be set, but the whole pay system. Trade unions consider the interests of their members, who are often earning more than a minimum wage and have no interest in becoming a minimum wage worker. They're concerned over their purchasing power and their career prospects. And employers similarly think about how they can offer careers and advancement to employees, which means that they need to grow from that standard minimum level and be able to develop to higher wages and higher occupations as well. As well as we see large concern over, especially in employers in the northern welfare states, over how to hire staff in times of labor market shortages and the ability to be able to maybe offer attractive wage packages. And so if the minimum wage goes up and threatens to catch the higher salary groups, how do collective bargaining partners deal with that? And so there are a couple of things that I want to take away from this or share with you now that we can then go into a bit more discussion, hopefully later in this webinar. The first thing is that pay scales really differ, or countries really differ in the extent to which their pay scales cover the full wage distribution. And that also means that the impact of an increasing wage floor is going to be very different across these different systems. In the example of the Czech manufacturing sector level agreement, for example, which you see at the top right corner here, you see a red dot for each step of the collectively agreed pay scales. And you see that those red dots really only cover the very bottom of the full wage distribution, which are the blue bars that you see across that entire figure. And that means that this kind of agreement actually is quite vulnerable or quite directly impacted by increases of the minimum wage. As soon as that minimum wage goes up, it catches the pay scales of this collective agreement, meaning that there is very little margin for negotiation and very little flexibility to react to that minimum wage going up. And we also get from qualitative interviews that were conducted in 9 countries by our colleagues from FDV in Italy and CELSI in Bratislava and our colleagues in Utrecht in Estonia and the Netherlands, that this can really lead to reluctance of especially smaller employers to pay more than the minimum wage. It can even jeopardize the ability to still close or negotiate collective agreements at this sectoral level, preferring to then just refer to the minimum wage, the statutory minimum wage. And we see that in sectors or in countries where those pay scales start a little bit farther above the minimum wage, there's a little bit more flexibility to find a compromise between that increase of the minimum wage and the increase of the collectively agreed pay scales. And secondly, we see that bargaining traditions really differ in the extent to which how detailed or how long pay scale systems are. So we find some collective agreements that contain minimal payable rates for maybe 3 or 4 occupations. Often, like in that Czech agreement, close to the bottom. But we also find collective agreements that include over 20 different salary groups, and each of those salary groups has multiple pay rates to allow you to go up one step a tiny bit each year. And in some of those cases, we find these pay scales go up to jobs in which employees earn over 14,000 euro a month. And in our qualitative interviews, what we see is that in those negotiations, increases of the minimum wage can carry substantial cost or are in danger of doing so. So what we see, imagine that if the minimum wage goes up by 10%, or even by 20%, as it did in some EU member states last year, the cost of raising the wages of workers in all pay scales up to all those workers earning 14,000 a month is considerable and really increases that total wage share that goes up once you agree on that collective agreement. And so in those cases, we found negotiators were often forced to consider alternatives, like giving some salary groups a larger pay rise than others, which was then politically sensitive, or reorganizing the entire pay system in order to often collapse some of the lower paid salary groups into each other, into larger groups, or to, at that point, drop some of the higher earning salary groups out of the consideration or coverage of the collective agreement. Finally, there's just one more thing that I would love to share with you about the qualitative interviews with the trade unions and employer negotiators that we conducted in the 9 countries. And that is that it brings up several questions about the way in which the Minimum Wage Directive might impact social partners' ability to bargain collectively on pay. And the first is that when we speak to negotiators about how their negotiations were conducted over the last 10, 15 years, we see that in all countries, the trend since the 2008 financial crisis has often been towards decentralizing of wage setting, and that is with the exception of Austria here. But that means that either more wages are collectively bargained on the firm level that used to be bargained on the sector level, or a larger component of those wages is bargained at that firm level, allowing also more differences to start to exist between high-paying firms and low-paying firms. Or in many cases, just a total decline of the coverage of collective bargaining in the country. And we see that a particularly interesting case that our colleague Adam Sumikras is also going to go into in one of the next presentations, is that of the Central Eastern European countries, where over the last decades, legislation has really taken a place traditionally taken by sector-level collective bargaining, meaning that wage setting has become much more important at the legislative level than at the sector level. And that's really hollowed out the sector level agreements, meaning that in order for that EU Minimum Wage Directive to be effective in those countries, we really also need to start thinking about how to reverse that trend, or if there is a way to actually bring up collective bargaining and collective bargaining coverage without resorting to sector level bargaining. And so all in all, that also means that throughout all of these developments toward decentralization, there's been a growing discretion of individual employers over wage setting, again, with the exception of Austria. Meaning that the connection between the wages that are in the collective agreements and the freedom that employers have to pay a little bit more or to decide on whether or not to give some employees a wage increase and others not, has really substantially increased over the last couple of decades. Again, then prompting the question whether giving or promoting collective bargaining will directly actually lead to wage increases for those workers exactly at the bottom. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Janna, for this super insightful kickoff presentation. We would now like to invite, together with Janna, Rosica from Isturet, Bulgaria, as well as our colleague Dumitru Fornea from the trade unions in Romania, now based in Brussels, or now currently calling in from Brussels. And Janna, you have some questions to ask the both of them about their negotiation.
I do. Thanks very much for that introduction. Let me just firstly welcome you both, Rosica and Dumitru. So for everyone in the room today, I'd like to welcome Rosica Makalova. She's the Scientific Secretary at the Institute for Social and Trade Union Research and Training in Bulgaria, and is joining us with all our expertise in cost of living and the sector level analysis of industrial relations. And we're joined by Mr. Dumitru Fornea, who's the Secretary General of the National Trade Union Confederation Meridian from Romania, and is also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, and as I understand, currently based there and taking out some of his valuable time with us here before running back into negotiations in Brussels. So thank you for joining us here today. What we really would like to do in this webinar is give everybody some impression of what the practice of collective bargaining and negotiating over wages in this time of high inflation, of increasing minimum wages, and all of that has been like. And I would like to ask both of you to start by introducing yourself a little bit, especially telling us what your involvement is in fixing or negotiating wages, and perhaps a little bit of a background of both of your countries, which have both also experienced some large minimum wage hikes in the last couple of years. And if I can maybe start with Dumitru.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for invitation. Indeed, I have a meeting here in the committee, and I have to leave quite soon. I can stay a few minutes. I am involved somehow with the Confederation, but also we have discussion on the sectorial level. But what is related with the minimum wage, it's a matter of national social partners, employers organization and trade union organizations, as this is the case in Romania. And of course, from one side, it's the government, which we have a national tripartite committee for social dialogue, where this statutory minimum wage, gross minimum wage, which is applied to the entire territory of Romania, it's established almost each year. Depends also various factors, depends, for example, of inflation rate, depends of convergency policies to the European Union. We started this process since was called the Snagov process. It's a place in Romania. Romania was a negotiation for 5 years for of social partners, where they try to see what is the wage policy which we have to follow in the light of our accession to European Union. And this process has been somehow institutionalized. We have to tell you that we started with a minimum wage in January. I give an example, which was the lowest in January 1999. Where was the 28 euros, the minimum wage, and that was the brute. And with the time in 2007, in January, when we entered in the European Union, was around 140 euro, and in the October 2023, around 607 euro, and now we are, I think, somewhere with the gross around 745 euro, which is it's an important increase. But also we have to understand that the prices also are very high. So in a way, we are offering paper to the people, because if we compare with minimum consumption basket for a decent living, we see that, for example, if we speak about, because netto, the 745 euro, it's around 476 euro. So this is it's very more compared with this basket, because the normal for a single person, this minimum consumption basket, it is around 767. So you see, it's missing from because you have this basket, and afterwards you have the gross, the netto for 476. So you have a difference of 291 euro, which is between if the gross can cover the basket, but the netto doesn't cover it. So that it's our fight now, in order to go with this wage policies in line with the real necessities of the workers. So we have various types of, you in your study you discussed about this, the countries which are having this tradition of collective bargaining, mostly Nordic countries, where they can agree with employers. But in Romania and Bulgaria, I imagine, in other countries in the East, the minimum wage was an important decision to relocate on industries, and was part of the negotiation which our government had with this multinational and so on. So it was a strong fight to not increase this, because this minimum wage was seen as a how to say, increase of operational costs. Of course, now we have.
Can I also ask you, because one thing I also happen to know you've recently changed the law to make collective bargaining obligatory again in firms, and I'm wondering if you're talking about reaching that cost of living and increasing the wages to adequate levels, what hope do you have for collective bargaining? Do you think that that is going to be the solution in Romania to get higher wages?
Collective bargaining, yes, we have a discussion. We changed the law because in 2010, when this corporation has entered in Romania, they pushed very hard to have their law. After 10 years and so on, they see the European Commission saw that we have a problem with the collective bargaining, because there was no collective agreement which has been signed, no national collective agreement and so on. So now with the new law, theoretically, we have the possibility to increase this collective bargaining processes. We know that we have just one negotiated recently with the banking union or something, which is negotiated the first collective bargaining on sectorial level. But the discussion now is more related with this minimum wage, with the adequate minimum salary wages, the directive, where it's this standard of 70% of the workers should be covered by a minimum collective bargaining. And in this regard, we have now some discussions, but the employer side, it's quite reluctant to rapid progresses and evolution on this regard. And the only solution to achieve this target in Romania is to reintroduce the collective bargaining at national level, which will give actually a coverage of 100%. It's like in the old time, you have 100%. But in reality, we know that will not be an easy task, because are the small and medium-sized enterprises. They have a huge fiscal burden, and this burden, in Romania, we have also a transfer of contribution to the employee, from the employers to the employee, that it's also put it in discussion now, because it's considered that the taxation, the fiscal burden for minimum wages or the small wages is too high compared with what is happening in other parts. But for this, you need to have a system which is differentiated according to your revenue. So this can be a complicated issue with the government, which doesn't have now electronic system integrated as it's in other parts, and even the population is quite reluctant to so much control from the government to have all this data and so on. So it's a discussion, but collective bargaining are not seen as a value for the minimum wage, are seen as a value for the revenues, because beyond minimum wage, in many of our countries, you have other advantages. Otherwise, you will not be able to survive with a minimum wage. It's a base, and we have even a change in the labor code. It's Article 164, paragraph 21 from the labor code, where they said that starting since January 2022, the base gross minimum wage in Romania can be applied for a same employee just for a period of 24 months, and that afterwards you should increase this wage. The problem was not having collective bargaining. How you will do this increasing? It's at the attitude of the employee, of the employer. Sorry. So that is the problem. So and another issue for Romania was because the rate of fiscal revenues was quite low. The recovery rate. So they try to fix the revenue, the fiscal revenue from the international corporation via this minimum wage. Increasing the minimum wage, you force in a way the corporations, because this is the only transparent way. You cannot fiscally optimize these revenues. What is happening? Our companies like Vodafone, like I don't know, all these delivery companies, all them are paying the many people with the employees with minimum wage, and afterwards they come with other forms of revenues. Our values, bonuses, and so on. But their turnover and their revenue, they profit, in a way, it's a registered and fiscal paradise, and always they have losses. So it's a company, they are a company with losses which are operate from 10 years in our territory, and they have always losses. And the only way to receive something from this company was the wage, of the employee, because that was automatic deduction, automatic, sending this money to the fiscal authority.
If I can, thank you, Dimitri. I also would really like to bring in Rosica in the conversation here. I see you've unpinned yourself at the moment, but it would be great to have you back here. Because I'm wondering also, I've seen you nodding a lot, and sometimes I think in things that you recognize from Bulgaria, but I also know you have a little bit more collective bargaining, and in the collective bargaining, a strong link to the minimum wage when you do talk about wages. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about wages in Bulgaria as well, and how that collective bargaining can or cannot reinforce the minimum wage in your country.
Yeah. Hello, and from me, hello from Bulgaria. Yeah, I know it a lot because every time I listen to the examples coming out from Romania, I recognize that the situation here in Bulgaria is pretty much the same, despite some few differences. But yeah, minimum wage is particularly important in Bulgaria. Actually, depending on the minimum wage rate, the unions in Bulgaria are able to negotiate even better minimum salaries and wages within the companies and within the sector level agreements as well. So yeah, the minimum wage is a huge thing for the union movement here in Bulgaria, because it really sets the base. It sets the base, and actually maybe we are going to discuss it later on during the panel discussion. But the minimum wage directive actually brought a lot of talk and a lot of discussions within the National Council for Tripartite discussions, but also within the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy. And unions are really struggling to make the minimum wage setting in Bulgaria transparent and based on the criteria within the directive itself. Maybe to say a little bit about the union demands within the national debates on the establishing of the minimum wage, on the transposition of the minimum wage directive in Bulgaria. Unions are really looking towards the thing my colleague from Romania said about the cost of living. And how we will actually set a link between the minimum wage and the cost of living. And I guess in Romania, the unions are also the only actor that is in charge of calculating the cost of living, the basket of goods. I believe this is the situation in Romania, and actually this is the situation in Bulgaria as well. Because currently the employers do not recognize the living wage, the cost of living as a criteria, and actually within the national level debates we are not discussing how to link the minimum wage and make this minimum wage actually a living wage. So maybe this is so far from me, and I'm going to speak about
yeah, thank you. And I think maybe for both of you, what I'm really interested to hear from you as well is you both live in countries that have a minimum wage, even if there's a lot to be wanted for that living wage before it becomes a living wage. You have that reference. And I'm wondering, when you go into negotiation as trade unionists and you try to get pay scales negotiated and get higher wages for your members, to what extent do you try to negotiate wages that are a certain level above that minimum wage? Are you trying to, for example, do you start with wage offers or wage demands where you say my members have to earn at least 10% more than the minimum wage? Does that come into your negotiations at all, or is that not something you look at? Go ahead.
I can tell you a little bit the situation in Romania. With minimum wage are people which are not in trade unions, and that is the problem, because they encourage also was against a trade union, against unionizing the workers in the last 10 years. So only the people which they are not in this, and are a lot, mainly in multinational companies, and the medium and small and medium-sized enterprises, but that it's understandable from certain perspective. But in multinationals, they are all working together. So normally they should be unionized, or they should have this possibility to learn about it. But we have even intimidations to some people which they try to have unions in these companies. Not all of them. So in these companies, you have this minimum wage, but in the rest, where is the people are unionized, it's not usual to have minimum wage. It's not usual. You can have something at the unity at the level of the unity, the company level. Depends of the sector, because it's a market, it's a labor market which is establishing this. You realize that nobody can live with a minimum wage in Romania. That it's just a basis, a reference base. But in reality, the companies, even the private company, they know that the people would not stay for the minimum wage, and they pay additional benefits. And I give you the example that we have now. The problem is now when they saw that they have a huge issue with recruiting new people, they now recruit people from Asia, for example. So from 210,000 people, foreign workers in Romania, 150,000 are from Asia, recruited recently. So they wanted to have a contingent of 140 for this year, but the union rejected. We rejected even more than 20,000, but they succeeded during the pandemic crisis to increase the contingent abusively from our point of view, without justification and so on, just to create a social dumping, because this is what they created in Romania with non-EU workers. It's not about the problem of the EU workers. It's about non-EU workers, which are introduced in Romania backdoors, without the control from the unions and from the relevant authorities. So these people, even these people, they are not paid with the minimum wage. That is the problem. In spite of the fact that we still have in a country 50% of our people which are paid with minimum wage, because they are captive workers of this multinational organization, which are in countryside or in regions which are quite poor or don't have the same level of opportunities like the big cities of Romania. So that is the problem. It's a matter of convergence and cohesion, and which is the responsibility of the Romanian government. The employer side, they try to gain some, time in keeping the situation. We understand the situation of the small and medium-sized enterprises. We understand also some of the problems of the others, because they relocate in Romania just because it was a low wage. The problem of us, we are no longer interested to have low wages. We're no longer interested in this model of business. We try to sophisticate the economy and the sectors in such a manner that you don't live with the minimum wage, because otherwise we go back in the past. We need to find ways to sophisticate and to become competitive and to have better wages for all. So that is the problem. They try to keep us captive in this system. And we understand the dilemma of the government, because the government, what will do with these people which are living from this minimum wages and plus bonuses for food and so on, or something like this. So it's a vicious circle where you can exit. How? You need to attract new type of investments, FDI, and you need to build your infrastructure in order to create mobility for the people to go rapidly to those jobs and which are better paid, which are mainly in the big cities. That was the problem. We didn't succeed to create value added or good jobs in some regions. And that is the next, discussion, even in the union, how we can fix these people. But the big discussion is how we convince from our 4 or 5 millions, nobody knows, including the government, of Romanians, which are living all over Europe, how to convince them to come back and to work. At least 1 million, not 4 million, 500,000 workers to come back to work in their own countries. And that is not possible without a coherent wage policy at European and national level. This is the big game, because we consider that this game, which is now initiated by these corporations, it's not in our interest, and it's because have externalities. They bring people in the country which they have no skills. You need to train them. You need to train them, but moreover, you need to pay some rights to them in their own origin countries, which are external. It's not the same like in between Spain and Romania. It will be between Spain, Romania and Nepal. So the cost of transferring all this will be very expensive in the future. So nobody puts this question, because these firms of recruiting, they proliferated very much in Romania, and they are doing an extractive job on the labor market. So that is why we minimum wage for us, it's just a mere indicator where we are, but it's not very much related with the quality of life in Romania, because nobody will be in the situation to live with a minimum wage.
Thank you, Dumitru. Thank you for. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to interrupt you there to make sure that Rosita also still gets a last word in. But thank you very much for, and also your time, because I know you need to run into your negotiations. But thank you for also pointing that out, especially that's not been mentioned before, indeed, that those new targets of raising that minimum wage also really clash with some economic policies in the region. I want to take, we're already running over time, Rosita, but I do want to give you some last opportunity to react to this as well. And that's, is there anything that if you already have something that you would like to share on this, then please go ahead. And if not, then I would really like to ask you, like, where do you see the change in upward in that kind of strategy? Where do you see the higher wages and the decent wages come from? Are they going to come from legislation? Are they going to come from bargaining? How do we reach that in Bulgaria? And I can't hear you at the moment, Rosita.
You can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. I just said that certainly for the case in Bulgaria, we should start with the legislation, and after that comes the collective bargaining. That's why I said, as I said, unions are that much struggling to establish a clear and transparent process of minimum wage setting, which follows the economic logic, the economic situation in the country, and which actually helps to transform the minimum wage to the living wage. As to the collective bargaining, just to say a few words, in Bulgaria, there's official statistic about how many labor agreements use the minimum wage as a reference and actually build upon it, making, for example, a coefficient to the minimum wage and then establishing higher minimum pay rates for the companies. And actually turns that a fourth of the collective agreements are using the minimum wage as a really starting base for the negotiations, either in the company or in the sector. Maybe I won't take much more time, and I'm also eager to listen what is happening, especially if you're going to discuss what are the current developments around the minimum wage directive. Because, and just to finish, to say that the debate, unfortunately, in Bulgaria is I would say directly dead, because we are in a situation where for over 2 years we cannot establish a functioning and a government, and that's why the transposition process of the minimum wage directive really has stopped, and the social partners haven't seen the government representatives for 2 months, I will say. And I know that during the end of the year, each country should transpose the directive and establish either the action plans on greater coverage rates, or the minimum wage, this transparent minimum wage mechanism that I said. But actually, the process in Bulgaria is quite strict in the moment, and that's why I'm going to follow the whole discussion, and I'll be grateful if you, if the speakers that are following are going to discuss the developments around this directive in their countries. So thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to present the situation in Bulgaria, and I'm online.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rosita. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Dimitra. Thank you both for giving this insight into the country situations. And with that, let me hand back to Fiona.
Thanks a lot, Janna, Dimitri, and Rosita. Thanks for sharing. Good luck. Bye-bye. Thanks for being with us. Next up, we have our researchers who will share with us a little bit more in-depth results from the studies that have been done. We have, to kick it off, Martin Gouzy, who will share with us some insights from the BARWAGE project and things that we really shouldn't forget moving forward. Martin, go ahead.
Thank you, Fiona, for introducing. Do you see the slides well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So this is a joint project with Janna and Kea. It's titled Beyond the Minimum. So here in this project, we try to understand the interplay of the statutory minimum wages and collective bargaining, because in Europe, these two are present in many countries. And the interplay between these two is not that clear. So it could be that the highest statutory wages set at higher levels make the collective bargaining agreements less efficient, or it can be vice versa. So this open empirical question that we try to answer. So in our paper, we use structural planning survey data from 2018 that includes more than 2.5 million workers from 17 EU countries that have the statutory minimum wage in place. And we look at workers who are paid very close to the minimum wage. So their earnings are not higher than like 110% of the minimum wage, so very, very close to the minimum wage. In our sample, this is about 10% of workers, and from the sample statistics, we see that the risk of this low pay, so in this incidence of low pay, is lower for workers, for group of workers that work in firms that are covered by collective agreement. Of course, there are differences, compositional differences. So the workers are covered by the agreements. They are low educated. They are more likely to have permanent contracts, and they are more concentrated in public sector. So we look at how these risks change by doing state-of-art econometrics models. And then on average, we find that the reduction in risk is by 30%. So when we compare to workers, those who work in companies that are covered by firm agreement, they face 11% risk of being low paid compared to those who are in firms that are not covered, 16%. But these effects are different across the industries, across the sectors. And this is the nature of the collective agreements that are based at the sectoral levels. And we see largest reduction in the risk of protective role of the collective agreements in the sectors that require more manual labor, also male-dominated, such as construction, manufacturing. The second question, important question that we ask, is whether there is a crowding out. So whether in countries that have the minimum wages set at higher levels, the protective role of collective bargaining is lower. So this is characterized by the KAIDS index. The higher KAIDS index means that the minimum wages are set at the more generous or higher levels. And the difference between these two lines, like dashed line and solid line, defines the reduction in the risk. So the higher the difference between these two lines, the more protective of the effect of the collective bargaining is more important. And we see that this difference is larger at the higher end. So in the countries that have more generous levels. So based on our research, we conclude that indeed there is the protective effect of collective bargaining is also found that in the countries that have higher statutory minimum wages, which is like good news for the European agenda on adequate wages, because it means that setting a target for minimum wages does not make the role or collective bargaining weaker. So I would finish here. If you have any comments, you can send by emails, or we are happy to discuss them.
Thanks a lot, Martin. And with that, I would like to immediately move on to Adam Smikrast from CELSI, who's also part of our researchers group. Adam, can you share with us a little bit information about how wage setting processes and structures are different in a lot of the countries that you've researched? Adam, you have the floor.
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone. So I will present you some BARWAGE project results with focus on the 3 countries. So the title is The Wage Setting Between Legislation, Bargaining, and Individual Discretion, the case of Central and Eastern Europe. So we covered Czechia, Bulgaria, and Estonia. And some motivation and research questions are based on what is common for these countries, and also broadly for Central and Eastern European countries, is that they shared some characteristics in regard industrial relation systems. So there is underdeveloped sectoral bargaining structures, and in general a wage gap compared to the other countries from Europe. And the questions are, what is the relationship between wage setting via legislation, including minimum wages, and collective bargaining in such conditions? What part of the wage is collectively bargained, and if are there some cross-country and cross-sectoral similarities? So again, the overall industrial relations, industrial system trends in Central Eastern European countries are union decline, union membership decline, also in the embedded neoliberal country group, Czechia, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, but also in Estonia and Romania. There is union fragmentation, union landscapes, diversity, new unions emerging, fragmentation along occupational groups. There is also regarding bargaining coverage, mostly company level bargaining prevalence, little capacity to coordinate bargaining at the sectoral and national level. And regarding employers, there is a lack of organizing on the employer side, and so the trade unions lack a bargaining partner. Here is just the bargaining coverage. So for just some numbers, Czechia is about 35%, Bulgaria about 23, 25, and Estonia is the last in this regard with about just 6% of bargaining coverage. So we focus on 4 sectors, and here are the basic characteristics. In construction, there is a high share of self-employment and bogus self-employment, also high share of individual contractors, and there is a prevalence of small and medium-sized enterprises, and is important for economies in all studied countries. In waste management, there is increasing importance as part of all this ecological transformation. It's a growing employment in Europe. It's often municipal services, decentralized, and also partly privatized or outsourced. In hospitality, this sector was strongly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, but still it's an important source of employment. For example, in Bulgaria, it's about 10% of the workforce. There is larger incidence of seasonal and undeclared work, also many small and medium-sized enterprises, and also low bargaining coverage. And urban transport, it's a reasonably high employment in all studied countries. It's part of the urban transport is publicly provided. There are different bargaining dynamics, also privatization process, and high bargaining power because of an essential. This is an essential sector with unified workforce. We are able to create disruption in the economy. So now more detailed information in sectors. I will start with the waste management. So in Estonia, it's just 0.6% of active workforce in Estonia. No trade unions, no employer organization, no collective bargaining. Last bargaining was about more than 20 years ago in private company Ragn-Sells. Wage levels not the lowest, but they are higher than hospitality and construction, but there are regional differences. In Czechia, there are also regional wage differences in this sector, also no sectoral bargaining as the whole, but due to some overlapping activities, for example, in road maintenance, some part of the workers are covered. And on the company level, for example, in Prague services, wage tariff tables from the collective bargaining agreement closely mirror the statutory minimum wage, but surcharges for waste management. In Bulgaria, there is decentralized to municipal level, 27 municipal CBAs for waste disposal recovery, 4 CBAs for mediation and other waste management services, 71 agreements for water collections, and also 2 CBAs for sewage. Municipal CBA is likely to set minimum occupational wages above the statutory minimum wage. The next sector is construction. In Estonia, there is also no sectoral CBA. Wages follow the statutory minimum wage. Why no bargaining in this sector? There is a confidentiality in company info, common envelope payments on top of the formally earned minimum wage, and is also characterized by the low job security. In Czechia, the situation is different. It is, in fact, the most developed sector in country regarding sectoral bargaining. Coverage is pretty high, from 60 to 70%. There is uninterrupted bargaining from the early 90s. Sectoral agreement typically for 5 years. Only the first sectoral wage floor mirrors the statutory minimum wage, so the wages are higher. And there is also sectoral bargaining for the pay supplements like the night work, weekend work, on-call, and so on. In Bulgaria, 50 to 60% of workers' wage determined by statutory minimum wage. One sectoral CBA valid until 2022 with supplementary wage stipulations for seniority and night shifts. Minimum wage multiplier for the construction sector, and 7 company CBAs, little coverage, most wages set outside of the scope of collective bargaining. Urban transportation in Estonia, this is the most active bargaining sector. There are both single and multi-employer bargaining, high sectoral bargaining coverage compared to the overall coverage of 6%, which I mentioned. But still, experts assess that salaries are still not sufficient. Company bargaining, for example, in Tallinn city transport, there is a slightly above the minimum wage. In Czechia, minimum wage has marginal influence on wages in this sector. On average, 8% higher earnings in the sector than average of the Czech economy. There are 4 separate higher level CBAs in this sector, which stipulate wage supplements, allowances. There is also high coverage by the company level CBAs, but regarding the sectoral level, I would also mention that this level is on decline. In the near future, it will probably disappear due to the change in the legal status of employers' organizations that are not interested in bargaining. And Bulgaria, there is predominance of municipal employers, differences across municipalities. Bargaining at the municipal level yields from 10 to 30 wage increases, and sectoral CBA expired in 2022, but it's currently renegotiated. And the last sector, hospitality, important for employment in Estonia, yet hard to organize workers. Only 2 company CBAs. Sector associations do not participate in bargaining. In 2017, assuming bargaining coverage was 3.6%. and 25% of wages based on commission. So there is also decline of tourism generally after the war in Ukraine affected wages. In Czechia, a high number of agency workers, enterprise level wage setting, 40% of CBAs in the sector contain a 10-tier wage tariff system pegged to increases of the statutory minimum wage, and 70% of CBAs, company CBAs, covers incentive components to wages, like performance bonuses. And in Bulgaria, low wages in the sector, high share of envelope wages, and also there is aspect of seasonality. Only one multi-employer CBA, which covers 3 employers. General challenge, no extension mechanism, and the sectoral CBA does not set a minimum wage, but encourages individual employers to set wages directly. So now I can jump to some comparative conclusions. So there is a clear sectoral variation in whether collective bargaining exists at all and in bargaining coverage. Statutory minimum wage as an important benchmark in all 3 countries, but not for all sectors. For example, for public transport. Company level bargaining most widespread, but most wages set outside of the scope of collective bargaining. But I would say, for example, for Czechia, it is true that wage setting is predominantly based on the company level agreements, with the exception of the hospitality, where, for example, in restaurants there are no bargaining. And yes, so regarding this information, there is a huge challenge to meet the target of 80% bargaining coverage. For example, in Estonia, but also for Bulgaria, there is no legal extension mechanism, and Czechia still a limited sectoral bargaining. So that's all. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Adam. And now, to not lose too much time, please, Salvo, our researcher from the Italian General Confederation of Labor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk about the implication of the Directive for Adequate Minimum Wage in the case of Italy, which, as you know, is one of the 5 European member states which has not a statutory minimum wage, but where minimum wages are set by industry-wide collective agreements. In Italy, there is at the moment a quite lively debate about the opportunity to shift from the traditional exclusive primacy of collective bargaining in wage setting to an unprecedented statutory minimum wage, which is a fact deserving to be stressed, as no one of the other countries with a similar system, not the same, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, is taking in consideration to change box. On the contrary, some of them have been extremely hostile to the EU directive in spite of what we consider soft prescriptions and clauses of safeguard. I will not recall about how in Italy pay floors are set by collective agreements, and also by the fact that there is no administrative extension mechanism. This double shortage of an ex erga omnes and of statutory minimum wage is something that in Europe, Italy shared just and only with Denmark and Sweden. So there is no time for entering in details. So what I can say is that the perspective of transposing, implementing the directive has been paving the way to a wider focus on the national industry relations as a whole and their performances. Because surveys and polls reveal strong discontent and dissatisfaction with the current wage standards, including their wage setting system. A large part of the public opinion has emerged to be favorable to the introduction of the SMW at the level of €9 gross, proposed by the center-left parties in opposition in a bill presented to the Chamber of Deputies in July 2023. a project already rejected by the current right-wing government, which is going to prepare a legislative decree with an alternative approach, apparently based on the extension of the most applied collective agreements, with no mention and references to the representative quality of the signatory party. For the time being, the implementing of the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive impacts on a country characterized by some flattering indicators in international comparisons on one side, but also by others that are unquestionably critical on the others. The highest collective bargaining coverage in the EU, and also saw in a slide of Adam, matched with the worst wage dynamic of the OECD countries, of the EU member states, which is a true paradox, which requires some quick insight. Let's start with two good news. They are basically two indeed quite remarkable. The first about collective bargaining coverage. International statistics credit Italy with nearly 100%, top of the list in the EU, and around 95% according to most of the national sources. This data come from the monthly communications digitally sent by employers to the National Institute of Social Protection, with the notable exceptions of agricultural and domestic workers. Even with assuming more prudential data, there is no doubt that Italy should be already aligned with the directive target of 80%. And the second good news, although difficult to be extrapolated, the KITES index by an average of 100 industry-wide agreements, it's estimated, for example, by OECD some years ago, approximately 75–80%, which is 20 points higher than in the other Adequate Minimum Wage Directive objective, and in the member states with the highest ratio, France, for instance, but also Slovenia, Portugal, they are around, as we saw before, 60–62%. From this double point of view, Italy seems to satisfy already the directive twofold decency threshold, as some commenters and policymakers say. There is no need, they say, to adopt an unprecedented SMW, but just some adjustment, as for instance, to making the comparably most representative collective agreement binding for all, cutting out the minor and representative ones making social dumping. Now, the very much and harshly debate point is in Italy. Can we really consider the situation so much rosy as it looks like at a glance? According to a number of experts, it is not, and it is not at all. Let's see why. These are points also for the discussion. 6 points and bullets in just for titles. The very high collective bargaining coverage represents a national cross-sector average without considering the differences, even remarkable, which exist between a sector and another. Second, the percentage includes the so-called pirate agreements. There are almost 800 out of a total of 1,000 archived, signed by small and unrepresentative social actors and making wage dumpings to the leader agreements. Although their coverage can be very often ridiculous, they influence indirectly the wage bargaining in a depressive sense in the arena of the main collective agreements and tables of negotiation. Point 3. Legal obligations and controls about the effective respect of the main agreements are weak and absolutely inadequate. So that is not uncommon that workers hired and paid for short part-time contracts are massively employed for longer working hours, especially low-paid sectors like the HoReCa or domestic work. 4. While minimum wages might appear to be adequate for a full-time and open-end employee, and this, for example, in a certain international statistics, only Sweden is better than us, around 5%, quite low, but it's not at all when considering the entire annual pay of individual workers broadly under the 60% of the national median wage. 24% of Italian workers, around 5 million, are low paid under that threshold. Point 5. When compared with the other 4 member states, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, with collectively agreed minima, the average levels of the low-paid jobs are in Italy much lower. There is a research from the Eurofound in 2022 considering the 5 and the 10 lowest paid sectors and branches in these 5 countries. And the differences are simply embarrassing on the Italian side, far away also from the constitutional principle of sufficiency to conduct a free and dignified existence, as in Article 36 of the Republican Constitution of 1948 for the workers and his or her family. Sixth and the last, very important, all the average wages in Italy are low and stagnant for decades. This is from OECD. We were the only country losing points in the last 30 years. ILO, we lost 12 points since 2012. And this explains also the very high ratio of the KITES index. In spite of the high coverage, the quality of the outcomes is very much disappointing. For instance, from the viewpoint of the wages indexation and agreements renewals, with long, huge delays, 2.5 years in average. Duration in Italy is around 3 or 4 years. So you have to add other 2 and 2.5 years of delay, with 55% of the Italian wage earners at the moment having their sectoral agreement expired and in ultra activity. So because of these criticalities, a wide block of actors and forces think now that the current system doesn't work well and it must be overcome. In summer 2023, the opposition's party, center-left, found an agreement precisely in climbing a bill on a minimum wage entitled Provisions for the Establishment of the Minimum Wage. Its key point, and the post-problematic and harshly debate, is that the minimum hourly wage is that set by the comparatively much representative industry-wide agreements, which still remains the key pillar of the system. But it cannot be less than €9 gross. So €9 gross starts to be now a sort of a floor under which no one can be paid. Among the main trade unions, CGL, the largest, and I'm here somehow representing it, is very favorable. The third, the UIL, is quite favorable. And the second one, the CISL, is unfavorable, still opting for the exclusive role of the collective autonomy. From this point of view, we could say that they are very close to the Scandinavian, let's say, approach, even if that's what we contest. We are far away from the Scandinavian standards and whatever. So are they too much or too little, these €9? Public institutes and agencies have calculated that 1 worker out of 4 earns less than that today. And it very much depends on what we do consider in the calculation, which is a problem also in international comparison. If we consider the very basic pay floor of at the lowest level of each sectoral pay scale, what is called in Italy the economic minimum treatment, only the 15 of the main agreements, the leader agreements, pay more than €9 per hour, and 85 do not reach that threshold. If instead we consider the overall economic minimum treatment, including the various deferred and severance pay, 2/3 of them are above that bar, with the rest a little bit under and only a handful under €8. Yet, with adopting a statutory minimum wage at €9 gross, the KITES index would be similar to the current one, approximately 80%, but on a different legal standard. That would mean 20 points beyond what the directive aims, and just 2 or 3 member states are the reach.
Salvo, can I ask you to round off because we're running over time?
To the conclusion, yes, there was a debate in the parliament. The Meloni government decided that it is going to legislate on this with a different approach, but in any way ensuring fair and equitable remuneration and combat underpaid workers, stimulate the renewal of collective agreement. But in conclusion, Italy, concluding remarks. In Italy, high levels of bargaining coverage, minimum, median, and average ratio trade union membership and density are quite strangely matched with a collective bargaining system more and more affected by opacity, uncertainty, fragmentation, weak enforceability, non-compliance, pirate agreements and wage dumping, but first and foremost, low and even very low wages at the risk of poverty in a growing number of sectors and jobs. That's a wide cross-cutting consensus that the whole system needs an urgent rationalization. We're reducing and selecting the true representative actors recognized as signatory of binding and enforceable agreement, cutting out the pirate agreements and the wage dumping. Aware that the statutory minimum wage and collective agreed wages are not alternative each other. See Spain, see France, see Germany, see the Netherlands. A wide bloc supports the idea of a law according to which no one in the country can be paid less than a given amount for a single hour of his or her work, which is basically 9 euro hours gross, is considered a good starting point, also in an experimental perspective to be tested in at the most risk poverty job, a choice of selective extension evoked by some individual experts. So a lower minimum wage is not enough if not accompanied by other measures. This is very important, like to strengthen the labor inspectorates and reduce the precariousness. Otherwise, it can be almost useless to fix at 9, 12, 14 euros per hour if the employer can easily manipulate on the real duration of the performance job. Even in Germany, they notice some forms of tricky, dirty thing from the German employers. So in Spain, for example, the socialist government moved that way successfully, and I think that this can be an example also for Italy. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Salvo. Thanks a lot. I'm very aware that we are running heavily over time and we still have a panel to run. So apologies for that. And if you have to leave, I get it. We will also share everybody's presentations at the end of the session. I would for now like to welcome Vasil Kirov, who is a professor and deputy director at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, Christine Omir Pintar, who's a senior research manager at Eurofound, and Dean Farthing, who's a partner of employment at PwC UK. And I'm very well aware that we have a short time, so thank you all for being here and sharing your valuable insights. Maybe to kick us off, Vasil, I would like to ask you if you could reflect with us on the possible impacts that the EU Directive on Adequate Minimum Wages may have on the support for trade unions and employers associations in their negotiations. And if you feel like also reflecting on the various presentations we've seen, how the directive will actually work out very differently in a number of countries.
Yes, Fiona, thanks for inviting me, and congratulations to all your consortium for this amazing project. It was really interesting to listen to the different presentations, really brilliant. It's a difficult question to talk about the potential impacts of the directive. No, sometimes we need to be more patient in order to see those impacts. It's a little bit, I'll make comparison when, for example, you sail or you navigate a ship, you need to turn a little bit, and after that the movement is a few minutes after. So I think with this new legislation of Europe, some effects will come a bit later. But I'll tell you probably just before that a nice story that happened to me about 2006 when Bulgaria and Romania were just waiting to join the European Union. They're doing, thanks to the Swiss government, by the way, really interesting projects to support social dialogue here in the Balkans, in Southeastern Europe, and to talking with people, social partners from different sectors, and to people with the light industry. They was like asking questions. Is it true that from the 1st of January 2007, our wages will double? And that's it. Unfortunately not. But it's a nice story that almost 20 years after, the European Union took some steps in this direction, just to answer this question that was asked before. And we have seen from the presentation that on the level of minimum wage, already there are some good examples, including in my country, Bulgaria, where under the previous mechanism, there were like a lot of efforts to go forward, but it was with the help of the union that minimum wage was able to increase faster. And of course, I know that some of the social partners are not still completely happy, and there are further steps to go. Second, I will agree with the Romanian speaker, sorry, Mr. Fornea, sorry, I forgot the name, but because sometimes in our countries, because of different factors, including developed wages, etc., in many sectors, minimum wage can indicate some trends, but it's not everything. It's not the same. I'm also very happy of what he said, because I remember also 20 years ago when I was visiting my friends in Sweden, Swedish trade unions were saying, we prefer some companies to quit instead of having low wages. At that moment, Bulgarian and Romanian trade unions were accepting large wage arrears, etc. I think also their mindset is changing a lot. So what about the effects of the directive now? I'm part also of similar project named SICAO. I see that still a lot of people on the ground are not aware about the support that the directive will bring to collective bargaining. But the good thing is that there is a debate starting, launching. All the partners are hearing. Of course, there are a lot of in some sectors, there are no employers organization. In some sectors, organizations of both partners are, I talk about the whole region, are very, very weak with just a few people. So there is, I think, a role not only of the European Commission, but probably the Commission with all its instruments, also to increase, but in a smart way, the capacity of social partners. Because I could say, as a Georgia, I could be a bit critical. The European Union and other organizations spent crazy amount of money to increase capacities. And in some countries, 20 years after, they say, we need money for capacity. So, but they should be strengthened. And I think we should go. I think the directive anyway should be implemented by the 15th of November. We know by practice from many other directives that we need 1 or 2 or 3 more years, and in some countries even a little bit more to be there. And after that, I think it'd be very nice to go again, to have a kind of similar panel in 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'm in that way, I am like a moderate optimist. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you, Pastor. We need moderate optimists. That's perfect. And you touched upon exactly something that I would like to ask Christine as well. And that is both in your reflections, could you maybe point out to what extent we should really focus on making sure that not only the minimum wage goes up, but other wages also go up? And just like Fasil shared, how long do you think we actually need to properly implement this directive in the next coming years? Will it be 3 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Fiona. I was so curious to see at the preliminary results of Janna and the team, because we are currently running a relatively similar project with a similar research question, but looking at different data sources. And so still work in progress, but I think many of our findings, I can already say, are being aligned, so that you do have this impact that you can measure and see of statutory minimum wages on negotiated wages on average across the board, with spillover effects being present. And then certainly, if you then go into depth, look at affected low-paid sectors, so in the lower earnings segments, where there is certainly a bit of a higher risk of this crowding out effect that the minimum wage directive does certainly not intend. So this would be, an unintended effect. So I should have started my intervention with a disclaimer saying I'm giving, my own opinion here, and then that's not reflective of the European Commission's or Eurofund's interpretation of the directive. But when I talk about the directive, I think the minimum wage directive, what we can say is that it has been very cleverly designed, and it has certain safeguards built in that this crowding out should not happen. And I wanted to mention 3 of these safeguards that I can see and that I interpret from the directive. So the first one is obviously this Article 4 on collective bargaining that is included there, right? So this idea that the member states when they increase the minimum wages, they should in parallel also ensure that there is a proper functioning collective wage bargaining in there. And the directive, okay, it measures collective bargaining coverage, not necessarily wages. So I was listening very attentively to Salvo's intervention. Collective bargaining per se does not ensure yet that wages are dynamically increased, but you get it. So if there is a focus on having a dynamic wage bargaining, then this helps to bring wages up also when statutory minimum wages are being increased. So that's the first safeguard. The second safeguard that I see in the directive is that nowhere it does say that every country now has to start going to these 50 or 60% thresholds anywhere, right? This is not mandated by the directive. The directive simply says member states, wage setters in the member states, you have to make sure that the minimum wages are being adequate. And adequate can mean, on the one hand, they should be fair in relation to other workers' wages. So there's this relative dimension that you can see captured in these 50-60% thresholds, but then also they should be adequate to ensure a decent standard of living. And that's by looking at how do minimum wage workers, when they're on the minimum wage, get by? What's the cost of living aspect, right? And the member states, the wage setters, they do not have to go for these 50 or 60%, but they have to choose which thresholds they use. It could be the 50-60%, these indicative reference values that the directive mentions, but it could well be any other threshold. And it could be any national threshold. And it could be like Janna presented her very first figure at the beginning. They could also start to compare their minimum wages with poverty levels in the countries. That's also possible by the directive. Just simply, the directive says, make sure they're adequate and define adequacy and do these adequacy assessments regularly. And the third safeguard that I see in the directive, that it doesn't swallow up all the wages of workers and everyone finally ends up being on the minimum wage, is that the wage setters are also obliged by the directive to look at the wage distribution. So not only, what happens in relation to statutory minimum wages, but what happens then if you, as a wage setter, then see, okay, wage distribution is, compressing and compressing and compressing. This would be, a point to say, okay, well, then we need to make sure that we get back on the right track. So to summarize, I think wage setters have a huge responsibility. They always had, but they will have even more. And it's a complex matter. It's not as simple as the 50-60% suggest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christine. That's, I think, really useful to know for everybody working on this. And maybe, Dean, to get to you, coming from the company perspective, perhaps, or those that support companies in getting these structures into place. You, of course, see companies picking this up because it's now becoming mandatory. Can you share a little bit of light on how you see companies dealing with these changes in wages, and also to what extent they make changes in the overall pay structure within their companies when it comes to dealing with these directives?
Yeah, so I'd probably take that second question first, and then I'll go on to some other things that they're thinking about. So, well, of course, we've got to recognise that there's a number of different markets. I mean, just as we've been talking through today, sort of the impacts in different territories and then different subsectors as to what may happen. But typically what an organisation is looking to do, first of all, it is that compliance with the minimum standards. So that's sort of an absolute. And then probably the next factor that comes into it is, how do they attract talent into the organization? And so there's two bits there if I focused on. So the first of that would be, how can I get enough of the right employees in, which typically means that you want to be paying above the minimum. So I think there's been lots of sort of conversations around what's the difference between effectively a minimum and a living wage, and I think that's quite an important definition for organizations, and certainly some of the more progressive organizations have definitions of living wage which are often above minimum wage there. And then the next piece that they're looking at is that sort of, how can I show progression in the wages as people step through in terms of their when they gain more skills and such forth. And so they won't necessarily look to retain the exact same differentials, but the idea of differentials is certainly there. And it's there not just because the workforce representatives may be looking for it. It's also important from an employer perspective to show sort of that progression. I mean, of course, there's a whole cost piece that comes across this, which is super important. And then I guess the second place I'd just like to go is if we look at another set of regulations that are coming in. So we look at CSRD, yeah? And this is where I think it's really sort of quite interesting and I would say clever from the EU in terms of how the different parts of the legislation are working together. So there's a couple of areas around CSRD, which is sort of going to be some mandatory reporting from many organisations with EU operations. So there is reporting around the concept of adequate wages. And there are some references in there to those 50 and 60%. So there's that concept of the adequate wages, but also reporting around collective bargaining. And so, you know, I'm a very much an optimist here. And so, you know, I think the more that we can see with our sort of larger organisations and such forth, with the disclosure that CSRD will drive, you know, hopefully that will start to drive the right behaviours amongst employers, and it certainly is the intention of the directive.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean. Maybe to round off our panel, because I want to make sure that everybody also has the rest of their day, can I ask all of you to share some reflections, maybe one by one, on where we think also next steps in research should go, perhaps, or research and action research perhaps, to get us further into supporting perhaps companies, but also those that negotiate, trade unions and employers associations, in actually getting the directive to be implemented across countries, as well as making sure that there's room and space for collective bargaining. Also, in light of the fact that we have to come up with some final recommendations at the end of our BARWAGE project. Perhaps, Fasil, you'd like to start with that?
Yes, I'll start with this. I think that it's important to support the sectoral level, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Already more than 20 years ago, the sectoral level was identified as the weakest link. And there are some sectors where there could be done something. The member states have also other instruments like related to public procurement, related to other levers that can be used in this indirectly. And as I said previously, there should be probably also kind of selective and smart support to social partners in particular sectors of interest, for example, low wage work and on the weekly covered sectors and so on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Christine?
Yeah, so I agree very much with what Vasil has just said, to focus on the sector level bargaining. I mean, this is where you get the coverage and you get the impact of collective bargaining. We are currently looking in this research project that talked about in depth into sector level collective agreements and how they are being affected by large increases of statutory minimum wages. And what we can see, there are some sort of trade-offs where social partners start to negotiate on the non-elements of pay as well. So some concession bargaining, giving up a little bit on the working conditions side in exchange for higher basic wages mandated by the increases in statutory minimum wages. So to pay attention on what's happening there, go deeper there, but also with a very practical view on you know, what are the limits, what is sustainable, what is not sustainable, and bring this knowledge then back to the consultative committees that talk about the next increases of the statutory minimum wage. I think this link is very, very important from a policy implementation point of view. And the other thought that I had is we will in 1 year, in 1 year we'll start with a new research project looking into how can collective bargaining, wage bargaining actually be promoted. And there, I think it is also interesting, particularly to go to these countries and sectors like in Estonia, like often in Romania now, where you don't have any functioning bargaining at all at the moment, maybe not even actors. So, I mean, where do you start from? And can we identify somewhere in Europe good examples where this has happened? I mean, it's much easier to start with an example in a country where you have a long-standing system, but what if there's nothing, no actors and no previous or a long stopped collective bargaining, and try to tease out what does it take to go back to bargaining again?
Thanks a lot, Christine. Very important points. Dean, any reflections from your side?
Just one really. I'm thinking really from the perspective of sort of large multinational employers. It's really sort of how can we help them access the information easily enough, which is around what is a living wage in any particular territories, but also that broader definition of the benefits that need to go alongside that. So it can be a, I'm going to put it in inverted commas, a real living wage there, so that they understand what that is, because I think that's quite difficult for many sort of multinational employers who want to do the right thing, is to understand what that needs to be. And so I think the more access there is to simple information for them, the better.
Thanks a lot. Great. Thanks a lot for your super insightful comments and also some next steps, which I think are extremely relevant also for our team of researchers. To round us off for today, I would like to ask Janna to share some closing reflections from your side. Thanks a lot, Fasil, Christine, and Dean for being part of this panel and also part of our research for many parts. Janna, you have the floor. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I would primarily just like to thank everybody for being here. The last panel, also the panels before that, for me, it's been really inspiring to hear your stories, to see to get another look at the results of your research. And thank everybody who joined us here today. What I'd like to say further is, first of all, everything you've said today and all your remarks are very, very valuable to us, because we have about 2 months left to finish up this project, this research, and so everything you've said today is something that's going to feed into our discussions about what our final conclusions are supposed to be, and especially also how do we make sure that our final conclusions actually include all of those things that are most relevant to you. So thank you so much for that. We are definitely going to look into all of the things that you talked about, and in particular, I think that sector level is going to be a very large part of our discussions. It's something also that's struck me personally as one of the most remarkable parts of speaking to social partners across Europe, also that especially the employer perspectives on that are so different, that we can look at 9 countries and see if a couple where employers are clearly the driving factor of sector level bargaining, and feel like there's hardly any point in collective bargaining if you can't be sure that the other employers in your sector are also paying those same decent wages. Compared to other countries where employers don't see that level playing field argument at all, and really are very distrusting of each other as well as of trade unions. And I think that part is really something to dig into deeper and to think about how that goes. And I think that the other large question that we will hopefully also really continue to work on after this project is how all of these interactions between the minimum wage and collective bargaining on wages are going to affect inequality of wages within firms as well. And how do we see whether, if that minimum gets pushed upwards, if we can maybe also compress wage inequality within firms a little bit without jeopardizing those career progression possibilities and the possibilities to actually hire good staff, but to see like what works. How can we adapt those pay scales and those pay systems in a way that keeps it fair, but also offers that progression? So thank you all so much for being here. We're going to be publishing the reports in the summer, the final reports, and we would love to be able to send you an email about that once they're online as well, so that you can go online and check out some of the reports. The first ones we presented are already out there, but the last ones we're finalizing also based on your comments. So thank you very much. And last but not least, of course, Fiona, thank you so much for sharing that today.
No problem. Thanks to everybody for being here. We will share the final recording and with everybody. And thanks a lot for joining us today. Be in touch. If you want anybody's email address of who was there, please feel free to reach out. We can send you that, and wish you a very lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.